Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today I have a very special video for you guys, as I'm going to show you not one, not two, but actually 10 different bass sounds, how to make them, how I process them all together, and how I arrange them into a 4-bar loop. So the goal for this video is to show you not just how to make a single bass sound as you might see in other tutorials, but actually to show you how to create a whole sequence of different bass sounds, and that's why I chose to show you 10 different options that you can use and also how you can use them within the sequence.
Hello, I quickly wanted to say if you want to support this channel, you can do so by listening to my music on Spotify or Apple Music, or by going to my website and looking at some of my products. There are even free ones that you can download really easily. Alternatively, if you're interested in private lessons, I also provide those, and all the information for that you can also find on my website.
So this is the project. As you can see, we have our kick up here. We have our 10 different bass sounds, which are laid out right here. Then we have a recording, and we have the sections that are used, as well as an arrangement track, which shows you how I use the different sections, how I use the different bass, and how I arrange them. So I'll quickly just play you the end result so you know what you're getting into with this tutorial. Let's just take a listen. So those are the sounds that we're going to be making today. I'm just going to go through and show you the different sounds one by one. They're all made in Serum, so if you have Serum, then this tutorial will be very easy to follow. But all of the sound design tips that I'm going to show you in this video can also be applied to any other synth, like Vital, Pigments, whatever synth that you're working with. So the first bass sound that we're going to be working with is the classic Psytrance bass sound. It sounds like this. This is a fairly aggressive form of it, and I'm going to show you how you can tweak it a little bit and make some changes to it to maybe make it a little bit less aggressive if you're more into a less aggressive Psytrance sound. So this is the bass sound here. And let's just have a look at the patch. So this is the patch right here. It's actually very, very simple. We just have a saw wave with a filter on it, a 24 dB filter. We have the velocity being applied to the level, so I can use that for sidechaining. But the bulk of this patch, where the sound designing really comes in, is with this LFO, the way that you shape this LFO here. Now this is set to envelope mode, and I've set it to 16 notes, so this LFO is actually a little bit shorter than the note that is being played. What you can also do, if you want the exact timing, is set this to 1/8 triplet, and then you get a little bit more of an open sound. So you can just hear the difference there. But where the sound designing really comes in is shaping this LFO. So this is where you make all of the choices, how you really want your bass to sound, as well as the amount that you set and the initial starting point for the filter cutoff. So by opening it up, it gets a lot brighter. I can open this up more, or just turn it down if I want a really dark sound. But for now I had it somewhere around this range. And then with this shape here, I can maybe make it a bit pluckier. And I can make it more sustained if I want to. So really the creativity of this patch really comes in by shaping this LFO to make it sound the way you want it to sound. Once we get into the processing, you can actually hear that a lot of the processing is really what makes this sound special and what makes it sound so fat and gives it the kind of weight that you hear in this sound here. Finally, I just quickly want to note that you can see that there's no effects being used in this patch here. As I said, all of the weight of this sound comes from the post-processing, which is being done on the group. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Now the second patch is this stab here, which sounds like this. It's a really nice sound to kind of start off a section. Once we get into the actual sequencing and the arranging of this bass, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But for now, let's just look at the patch. So you can see here, again, it's not too complex. We're just using one oscillator here. You can see that the waveform that's being used is a little bit strange. What I've done is I've taken the standard saw wave, which looks like this, and I've messed around with the phase here of these lower harmonics here. So you can kind of see that you kind of get a weird sound from that. This just gives it a little bit of a different sound. So now just going back to this shape that I chose here, let's run through the modulations really quickly. First of all, we have this first LFO here. Again, this is just set to the time of the note here. So this is actually equal to the note length, so 1/4. And this is controlling filter cutoff, as well our soft clipping distortion amount. Here we are using some effects to just give it a little bit more high-end mainly, and to give it the stereo width that we want. So this is for the stereo width, it's this dimension expander that we're using. Then the saturation is just to make it a little bit louder at this middle segment basically. And then finally the compressor is really taking out the high end. Without it, it sounds like this. Just boost that high end and makes it nice and crispy. The final modulation that we're doing is this one here, which is done on the pitch, and that gives it the pitch bending vibe that you hear. So if I bypass that, you can hear. It just gives it a little bit more movement and makes the sound a little bit more interesting. Now, if you want to make one of these sounds on your own, the really cool thing that you can do is mess around with this shape here and just dial in different kind of vibes here. So you can play around with that set. Different curvatures, stuff like that. For now I just kind of kept it fairly basic, just going up and then back down in the same shape. This third bass sound that we have here is a stereo kind of aggressive plug sound. The cool way that I'm using it is just to play one note. So for these other ones, as you can see, we're playing the 2 notes here, which just makes your standard kick and bass sound. And what is nice to give it a little bit of groove is to once in a while change up what notes you're actually playing. So in this case, we're just playing the last note, which gives it a different groove. Now I don't recommend that you make a song with just this kind of groove, but you can have it once in a while. Again, once we get into arrangement, I'll talk a little bit more about how you would do that and when you would want to do that within the sequence. So now going into the patch, you can see it's a little bit more complicated. We're using actually 2 oscillators in this case. One is again a normal saw wave. We've done nothing with the phase at this point. But the second one is also a saw wave. But what I've done is I've randomized all of the phases. So again, if we go back to our normal saw wave and just make something like this, you can see that if I click this here, you get a kind of like a random waveform. Now, the exact form of this waveform doesn't really matter. You can see there's differences between this, but that doesn't really matter for the effect. What this does do is that instead of having all of your high end within this one click, which is kind of where the high end of a saw wave lives, you have it spread out over the whole wave, which gives it just a different texture, makes it less clicky and more metallic sounding, which I really like for these kind of basses. The other thing to note is that this one is an octave up, so it's playing an octave higher than the actual note itself. Now again, just like our classic bassline, we're going through a filter, and this is going both A and B, and again we've dialed in a shape like this and set up our filter cutoff and our modulation amount accordingly. This is again where you can play around and kind of shape the tone the way you want it. But now going into the effects, we're using a soft clipper to make it loud. We're using both the hyper as well as the dimension to really give it a lot of stereo spread. I like for these kind of special sounds that I play only once in a while to have a lot more stereo. That just makes the sound a little bit more interesting. One thing to note here is that we have turned on retrigger, which means that it's actually going to start at the same point. So this hyper effect is going to start at the same point every time we trigger a note, and therefore every note is going to sound pretty identical. The dimension does introduce some randomness, but that's neglectable with if you were to turn this off, you would hear that every sound is completely different, as opposed to just with the retrigger where they all pretty much sound the same. And finally, we're going through a compressor, again for the multiband to bring out all of the frequencies and make it sound nice and crispy. I do really like the multiband compressor for this purpose here. It has that kind of OTT vibe, which you're all pretty familiar with, I think. Then we're going through an EQ, which just does a little bit of corrective EQing here, shaping in the tone a little bit more. What it does is it brings the mid-range out of the way and emphasizes the click right at the start here. So it's using this modulation here. And then finally, again, to give the click a little bit more presence at the start and make it less present throughout the sustain, we're using another filter to cut away the high end when this modulation goes down. So without those two elements, it sounds like this. Just makes it a little bit more plucky and snappier, which makes it a little bit more aggressive sounding. So now we're going to get into some of the stabs. Stabs are sound which basically, again, spend the whole note on the same kind of sound. So this is the first one of those two, which is this noisy kind of sound that you often hear in professional tracks. At least I've often heard this kind of sound being used once in a while. It's not the sound that I like to listen to over and over again. So again, as you can see it in this sequence, I've just used it once. So I classify this as kind of like a special bass sound, which you only really use very sparsely throughout your track. So going into it, what you can see is that we have the noise enabled, which is giving it that fizzly sound. And then we have, again, a basic saw wave, which this time goes through a filter, which is not being modulated. So to determine the tone here, you can really play with the filter cutoff. And then the final thing that makes it really fizzle is the distortion. We have dialed in a pretty strong distortion, dialed in some dimension for some stereo width, and I've dialed in again the OTT as well as the filter to keep the high end a little bit more in check. The effects really make the sound, because without the effects it sounds like this, which is really not what you want. As I said, the fizziness of it comes from this distortion, which basically pushes the noise and the saw wave, the filtered saw wave, together and turns it into one single sound. So then we have the hyperdimension, we have the compressor, and finally the filter to keep the high end in check, because this compressor does generate a lot of extra high end. So without it, it's a little bit too extreme of a high end for this track here. Next up is this different stab here, which has a little bit of an FM kind of sound, even though it doesn't actually use FM. There's a really cool trick that you can do with downsampling, which create these really cool, almost vocally like textures on your bass lines. So this is what it sounds like. So here what we're doing is we're using both oscillators to generate the tone, and then I'm using the sub to just get an extra little bit of sub out, which means that for both of these tones we've removed the lowest harmonic. Now the way I made these tones is this one is made using the analog BD sine. I can quickly show you that. What I've done is I've gone to the last frame here and I've removed this. So that's the fundamental, meaning that the sub is now removed. Therefore we reintroduce the sub within the sub oscillator. And then I've gain staged this each separately. As you can see, then you get this wavetable here, which is just a nice harmonic texture, mainly in this mid-range. Here, what I've done is I've done that same thing with the saw wave, where we have the saw wave and we randomize the phases. But from bin 16 onwards, I've right-clicked here, and then I've bin 16 to end, cleared all of the higher frequencies. That just leaves us with a nice mid-range tone. This oscillator is mainly there to give it a little bit of extra stereo width, therefore we have the detuning here as well. But we're also setting a random phase here, so there's a little bit of randomness, a little bit of a random position where they start. What I've done for this sound is I've actually made this, even though we're using multiple voices, I've made this mono, which you can do by setting the width here. So normally this is set at 100, which means that one of the voices is just going to play in the left ear and one of the voices is just going to play in the right ear. But now by just setting it down, that width just makes it completely mono. So you still get that effect of having multiple waves at different starting points and with slightly different pitches, but it's not actually introducing any stereo width within the sound. So these two oscillators sum together within the filter, which is adding the movement, together with the movement from turning up this level. So finally we get into the effects here. We first have the dimension expander, which just adds a little bit of stereo back in there. And it does it in a cool way. I do really like the dimension expander on bass sounds, especially stabs like these. And then we have set the downsampling here. And this is where you play with this value of the drive amount to really dial in the tone. So without it, it sounds fairly different. And this downsampling really gives it a cool kind of texture. I really like how it has a little bit of like a vowel-y texture to it. So as I said, you can play with this tone. Right now it's set at 42 if you want to get the exact same sound that I'm using. But just by playing around with this, you can experiment and find different tones. Depending on what kind of oscillator you're using here and how they are set up, as well as what filtering shape and what LFO shape you're using, you might want to change that around. So the next bass that I wanted to show you is actually a layer. So this layers on top of our main bass here in this first repetition and our secondary bass here, which I'll talk about later in this second part here. So this is basically like a stereo layer to give more mid-range presence to certain parts of the bass sound. Just makes it a lot more mid-range sounding and just gives that area a little bit more presence in the mix. So going through the patch, again, I've used a randomized saw wave here with its phases randomized, which is an octave up and detuned. I believe in this case I did leave it at 100 width, so we're actually getting stereo information from that. So one is in the left channel and one is in the right channel. There's no center one because we have just two voices. To fill in the center, what I've done is I've taken this other saw wave here and I've again removed the fundamental because we don't want that clashing with whatever it's layered on. So this oscillator is providing some mono stability and makes sure that it also is recognizable in mono. So those two oscillators both go again into the filter, and we're using the LFO again to shape the filter cutoff over time. I really like it, again, as I said, because you have a little bit more control over the exact shape that you dial in. So that's why I use the LFO as opposed to the envelopes. So going into the effects, I did want to make this sound very stereo because this is a stereo layer. So first of all, we just make it louder with the soft clipper, and then we're using the hyper as well as the dimension as well as the chorus for stereo effect. Now the chorus, when you use it like this, what I've done is I've set the filter all the way open. What you would need to do is filter out some of that high end again, otherwise it's just too extreme in the high end. You get a sound like this. So that's this filter is there again to just keep the high end in check, like we've seen before in other patch sounds as well. Finally, we're going through the compressor. Again, this is multi-band, just make it loud and make sure that it's at a level that we can use. The final thing to note here is that this is the only one that I've turned down in volume. You can see -5 dB here. So it's just a little bit below the level of all of the other basses. So to complement bass number 3 within this progression, we also have bass number 7, which performs a similar function in that it just plays one note. It's just a different sound. So it sounds like this. So this patch is actually based on an FM setup. As you can see, we have two sine waves here, and I like the analog sine for this use because it's a little bit dirtier. If we go into it, you can see there's some other harmonics in here as well, which just add a little bit of extra character to this sound. So this is at +1, and then we're using this LFO to set the FM amount as well as the distortion amount. So this sound really is a combination of the FM starting and then the distortion just bringing out all of the harmonics. And then it becomes a familiar sight. As you can see, we have a hyper dimension to add some stereo and a compressor to make it loud. So the hyper dimension is actually using a different LFO here just to keep it a little bit longer open as opposed to what we have here. And this is also used for the volume here. Also make sure in these cases that you set the volume of the second oscillator to 0 if you don't want that to output anything. So here, bass number 8 is a variation on this bass here, on bass 1. Just to mix it up a little bit, I want it to be a little bit more aggressive and just a different sound. Instead of having the same bass sound, plucky bass sound, be the main bass all the time, I decided to change it up a little bit and add this extra bass sound. So looking at the patch here, let's quickly listen to it. As you can hear, a little bit more aggressive than the other one. So looking at this patch, you can see it's a little bit more complex. Again, we're using the sub to create the sub bass for this sound. And then we have two oscillators which go through the filter again. And again, we're using the filter cutoff, which is now familiar with you, to modulate the filter amount. And then we have volume automations as well. We have a little bit of extra volume being added to the sub when it's actually sustained. And then we have the volume of these two sounds here as well being changed over time, just following this shape. So then the two main oscillators go through this hyper dimension. I think now you get the drill. This is to create stereo width. Again, we've set it triggered so that it's always the same sound. And then we're using this particular distortion type, which is called asym, which stands for asymmetrical distortion. What that means is that the top and the bottom are actually different curves. So you can see that this curve is slightly different from that. And what that means is that instead of just adding square series harmonics, which are odd harmonics, it's also going to add even harmonics to it, which makes it sound a little bit more saw-ish. It follows the saw wave harmonic series. So what that means in practice is that it just delivers a little bit of a different tone here. And that was just a sound that I liked. Then we go through the compressor. Again, it makes it loud and we get a little bit of extra high end, but I have turned down the high end quite significantly here with respect to especially this mid-range here. Finally, we're using this EQ here to boost the second harmonic and remove some of the fundamental, because we have that sub oscillator in here that just makes space for the fundamental frequency. Towards the end of the sequence, I wanted to add a little bit of a fill in there, and what I like to do is take basses and bass sounds from other genres for that, especially when working with progressive psytrance like this. So the first one sounds like this. So the way this is achieved is by using two sine waves here. This is also the analog BD sine, but with its wavetable all the way up, which adds a lot of harmonics. We saw that before when we removed the fundamental from that other one. In this case, we're not doing that. We're just putting them through a distortion. This is the strongest distortion that you can get from the tube distortion. And what that does is it creates this kind of FMish sound to it. And the reason why it does that is because this is 3 octaves up. So individually, they don't really sound nice. But together they kind of sum in a way that makes it sound really, really FM-y, even though no FM is being used in this bass sound. So coming out of that distortion, it goes into a dimension. As you can see, we have set a pretty high mix, and that's just to, again, give it a lot of stereo width here. I didn't like how the hyper sounded on this particular sound, so I took all of the stereo width from the dimension. After that, it goes to the filter where we shape the tone. And here what I've done is I've actually set it to 1/4 triplet notes, which, if we look at the waveform that I have below here, means that it's going to play right as the kick plays, as well as right here. It basically means that it skips this second note from the pattern. It would be equivalent to having something like this. 1 note there and 1 note there. Finally, again, we're using the compressor to just make it loud and bring out all of the frequencies, make it nice and snappy sounding. Again, without it, just so you can hear what it sounds like this. Just brings out a lot of mainly the high end and makes it a lot more present. Finally, this final bass is kind of like a classic dubstep bass sound. It sounds like this. And as I said, I like to incorporate basses from different genres, so I did a little bit of research on getting a classic dubstep sound, like an old school dubstep sound, out of Serum, and this is what I came up with. So we're using 2 wavetables here just to get a nice tone. This is 1 octave up from the other one, and then we have our sub bass here. And all of these are being modulated through that level with this LFO here, which dials in the shape, as well as the filter cutoff here. It's the same idea with the effects. We get some stereo width out of this dimension, just a little bit, and then we go through the tube distortion, as well as the compressor to just make it louder. So now that we've covered the synthesis of all of these 10 basses, let's actually look at how I process them. Now, each individual bass is actually not being processed outside of Serum. As you can see, just clicking through it, it's just Serum on a MIDI track, but they're all processed together within this group, and that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to actually creating the sound. So without it, it sounds a lot weaker, and it's just not really sitting in the mix well either. And again, with the processing, it sounds a lot nicer, as well as more glued together. So let's actually go plugin by plugin and see what's going on here. So the first plugin that we're using is Vitamin, and Vitamin is a multi-band exciter. And what that means is that it's actually going to introduce excitement or a little bit of saturation in individual bands. But what I really use it for is because of its filters and the way it introduces phasing. So if we quickly look at the waveform here, you can see phasing going on. Now remember, this was made with just a normal saw wave, but you can see that this is no longer a saw wave, and that's coming from the phasing, which means that because of all of the filters, different frequencies are going to be post-stringing and they're going to be delayed, and that just changes up the sound dramatically. So the next plugin in the chain is basically doing the same thing. We're using M Dynamics MB again for its phasing properties and the way it sounds when doing that, as well as applying some compression over the different bands just to make things loud. This is just set by ear, and there was not a whole lot to it. When you're going into processing, this is where you experiment and find the right settings for whatever sequence that you're working with. So the next plugin in the chain is M Stereo Processor. Now, because we're introducing a lot of stereo within these different bass sounds, we want to control it. The way we're doing that is with a multi-band processor like this. And again, because of its filters, it's going to introduce phasing, which we really like for this kind of aggressive bass sound. It actually performs kind of two tasks. Again, it does the phasing as well as some of the processing on the individual bands. So here are the settings that I came up with. And a general rule of thumb is that you have your bass sound itself lowered. So the lower frequencies are actually more mono. And then the higher frequencies, as you can see, are very wide here. Now these settings work with this sound. It might look a little bit extreme, almost 100% widening, but that's because a lot of the bass sounds didn't actually come with a lot of stereo information. So you need to really stretch out the stereo field if you want to get a full stereo bass sound. Finally, here we have clip shifter, which just puts everything into a clipper and makes it louder still. That also glues everything together. Just looking at the graph, you can see the gain reduction here, what we're achieving. You can see it's really squashing into the limiter, and sometimes we go to like -7, -8 dB of gain reduction. That is okay. It again is an effect which glues everything together and makes sure that all of the bass sounds are at the same loudness. Finally, we have our volume ducking here. This is just using LFO tool. The final thing that I want to say about this LFO tool is that we're turning it off when the kick is not playing. So we get this final bass sound actually sustained. Otherwise it would sound like this if I delete the automation and just make it all the way. You get another duck in there even though there's not a kick. So this just keeps it interesting, make sure that that sound comes through all the way. In my opinion, it just sounds better. So finally, let's talk a little bit about how I arrange these things. There's kind of a few rules that I go by. And the first one is that you want to divide up your loop into sections which have a little bit of cohesion between them. So as you can see, we have this A, B, A, C structure here, which I've drawn out using MIDI clips. What that means is that we have this A section basically repeating twice, in that there's very small variation in those two. I basically consider them the same section, even though technically these two sounds are different. But then for the B and the C section, they're obviously completely different in that they use a whole bunch of different bass sounds here. The only common thing that they have is this stereo layer. But even though the B and the C section are completely different, they actually do follow the same format. So let's talk a little bit about this format here. What I've done is I've labeled all of the initial stabs of a section as green, all of the special sounds as purple, and all of the triplet rolling bass line as red. And you can see that the section AB, if I duplicate this over, follows the exact same structure as AC. You can see that no MIDI clip, no color changes, so they follow the same structure. So a few things to note here in this structure is what I've gone for is I have one main stab which just announces the start of every 8 bars, and then we have special sounds which kind of denote the ending of certain sections. So we have one special sound here for the ending of A, we have 2 special sounds for the ending of B, again A, we have one special sound here, and then for C, we have 2 special sounds. So those were some of the considerations that I took into account when arranging this, and that's how I got to this final loop. So that's going to be what I wanted to talk about for today. I really hope you enjoyed this. This is a little bit different from what I usually do. I tend to cover a little bit less progressive psytrance, a little bit more of the classical psytrance, but I do really like sometimes diving into these different kind of subgenres of psytrance. So if you have anything that you want me to cover, anything in particular, then you can leave a comment down below. If you're new here and you want to see more of what I do, then subscribe to the channel. You can turn on notifications by hitting the bell icon so that YouTube sends you a message whenever I upload something, if you're into that. But for now, this is going to be the video, so I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.